On Materialist Dialectic by Karl Korsch. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin declared 2 years ago in his article, Under the Banner of Marxism, published in issue number 21 of the journal Communist International, that one of the two great tasks which communism must deal with in the field of ideology is to, quote, organize a systematic study of Hegel's dialectic from a materialist standpoint, that is to say, the dialectic which Marx so successfully employed in a concrete manner, not only in Capital, but also in his historical and political works, end quote. Lenin then did not share the great anxiety that someone just might, quote, via the idealist philosophy of neo-Hegelianism, end quote, smuggle, quote, ideological byways, end quote, into Marxist communist theory, an anxiety which is commonly voiced today by many of our leading comrades as soon as anyone at any time tries to undertake a practical attempt to engage himself in the program of Lenin's. A few examples might prove this contention. When a year ago, for the first time in 80 years, the minor publishing company published an edition of the larger Hegelian logic. A formal warning appeared in Red Flag on May 20th, 1923, of the danger this new Hegel would pose to all those who, in studying Hegel's dialectic, quote, lacked a critical knowledge of the whole history of philosophy and moreover an accurate familiarity with the main results and methods of the natural sciences since Hegel's time, end quote. Days later, in the Red Flag of May 27, 1923, another representative of the faction, then practically and theoretically dominant in the KPD, formally condemned Georg Lukács for his attempt, by way of a collection of essays, to, quote, provide the beginning or even just the occasion for a genuinely profitable discussion of dialectical method, end quote. The scientific journal of the German party, the Internationale, completely ignored the whole book by Lukács for reasons of simplicity. Bela Kuhn in his essay, quote, called The Propagation of Leninism, in the last issue of the Communist International, not only draws attention to deviations already current, but moreover observes that, quote, some communist publicists have yet, without a political name, could deviate in the near future into the revisionist bylaws, departing from orthodox Marxism, end quote. After these examples, of which there are many, one might suggest that the detailed demand which Lenin raised earlier, and lastly in the essay of 1922, that in our work of communist enlightenment we must organize a systematic study from a materialist standpoint, not only of the dialectical method of Marx and Engels, but also of, quote, Hegel's dialectic, end quote, did not meet with very much understanding in the leading theoretical circles of the Comintern, and still less among the theoreticians of the German Communist Party. When we look for the causes of this phenomenon, we must make distinctions. To one faction, typified by Bukharin's book, The Theory of Historical Materialism, the whole of, quote, philosophy has already fundamentally reached a point that in reality it was to reach only in the second phase of communist society after the full victory of the proletarian revolution, viz. The transcended standpoint of unenlightened past. These comrades believe that the question of, quote, scientific method is solved once and for all in the empirical methods of the natural sciences and the corresponding positive historical method of the social sciences. Little do they realize that just this method, which was the war cry under which the Burr class undertook its struggle for power from the beginning, is also today still the specific bourgeois method of scientific research, which it is true is sometimes theoretically renounced by the representatives of modern bourgeois science in the present period of the decline of bourgeois society, but which in practice will be clung to. To the other faction, this matter is more complicated. Here people see a, quote, danger in a, however, quote, materialistically, end quote, turned occupation, turned occupation with Hegel's dialectical method for the reason that they know only too well this danger from their own experience, and indeed secretly become its victims as often as they are exposed to it. This perhaps somewhat bold-sounding assertion will not only be illustrated but proven outright by the example of a little article, quote, on the matter of dialectic by A. Thalheimer, published in International 6, number 9, May 1923, and at the same time also in the information sheets of the Communist Academy in Moscow. In this article, Comrade Thalheimer links up with Franz Mehring's thesis, which I share and hold tenable, that from the Marxist dialectical materialist standpoint, it is no longer practical and factually not even possible to deal with this, quote, materialist dialectical, end quote, method separated from a, quote, a concrete, quote, matter, end quote. Comrade Thalheimer declares that although Mehring's rejection of an abstract treatment of the dialectical method represents as such a correct nucleus, it nevertheless, quote, oversteps its goal, end quote. To work out a dialectic is, quote, an urgent necessity, end quote. Inter alia, because, quote, in the most progressive parts of the world, proletariat, the need to work out a dialectic is, quote, an urgent necessity, end quote, inter alia, because, quote, in the most progressive parts of the world, proletariat, the need arises to create a comprehensive and orderly worldview, something that lies beyond the practical demands of the struggle and the building of socialism, end quote. And this furthermore contains within itself, quote, the demand for a dialectic, end quote. Comrade Thalheimer then goes on that in composing such a dialectic, one ought to critically link up with Hegel, quote, not only in relation to the method, but also to the matter, end quote. The genial progressiveness of Hegel is his demand that, quote, the inner, all-embracing systematic connection of all categories of thinking be revealed, end quote. This task would apply equally to the materialist dialectic. Hegel's method need only be turned over by which a materialist dialectic would emerge that would determine not reality by thought, but rather thought by reality. We believe that in all their brevity, these words of Comrade Thalheimer prove conclusively that he is altogether incapable of imagining the dialectical method in any other way than a Hegelian idealist way. Nevertheless, far be it from us to say that Comrade Thalheimer is an idealist dialectician. We have stated elsewhere, Lenin and the Comintern, that Comrade Thalheimer avows an apparently materialistic dialectical method in a later essay, which is in reality not dialectical at all, but is pure positivism. We can here supplement this statement by saying that as far as Comrade Thalheimer is a dialectician, he is an idealist dialectician and conceives the dialectical method in no other than in the dialectical method's Hegelian idealist form, and the proof thereof we wish to arrive at positively by stating that in our conception constitutes the essence of materialist dialectic, that is, Hegel's dialectic applied materialistically by Marx and Lenin. In doing so, we connect with the results of our earlier published investigations on the relation of Marxism and philosophy. It is high time to dispose with the superficial notion that the transition from the idealist dialectic of Hegel to the materialist dialectic of Marx would be such a simple matter as to be achieved by a mere, quote, overturning, end quote, a mere, quote, turning upside down, end quote, of a method remaining otherwise unaltered. There are certainly some generally known passages in Marx where he himself characterized in this abstract way the difference of his method from Hegel's as a mere contrast. However, whoever does not determine the meaning of Marx's method from these quotations, but instead delves into Marx's theoretical practice, will soon easily see that this, quote, transition in method, like all transitions, represents not a mere abstract rotation, but rather has a rich concrete content. At the same time as classical economics developed the theory of value in the, quote, mystified and abstract unhistorical form of Ricardo, Classical German philosophy also made the attempt, in a likewise mystical and abstract manner, to break through the barriers of bourgeois philosophy. Like Ricardo's theory of value, the, quote, dialectical method, end quote, developed at the same time in the revolutionary epoch of bourgeois society, and already shown in its consequences the way beyond bourgeois society, just as the practical revolutionary movement of the bourgeoisie also partly aimed beyond bourgeois society, before and until the proletarian revolution movement was to confront it, quote, independently. But all these perceptions brought forward by bourgeois economics and bourgeois philosophy had yet to remain in the last instance, quote, pure, end quote, perceptions, their concepts, the, quote, reconstituted being, end quote, their theories nothing but passive, quote, reflections, end quote, of this being, real, quote, ideologies, end quote, in the narrow and more precise sense of this Marxian expression. Bourgeois economics and bourgeois philosophy could well recognize the, quote, contradictions, end quote, the, quote, antinomies, end quote, of the bourgeois economy and bourgeois thought, and could even illuminate them with the greatest of clarity, yet in the end the contradictions prevailed. It is only the new science of the proletarian class which can break this ban, a science that, unlike bourgeois society, is no longer just, quote, pure, end quote, theoretical science, but is revolutionary practice at the same time. The political economy of Karl Marx and the materialist dialectic of the proletarian class lead in their practical application to a dissolution of these contradictions in the reality of social life, and thereby at the same time in the reality of thought, which is a real component of this social reality. It is thus we must understand Karl Marx when he credits proletarian class consciousness and his materialist dialectical method with a power that the method of bourgeois philosophy never possessed, not even in its last, richest, highest Hegelian development. Just for the proletariat, just for it and only it, will it be possible, through the development of its class consciousness, become practical in tendency to overcome that fetter of a still remaining, quote, immediacy, end quote, or, quote, abstraction, end quote, which for all purely perceiving behavior, for Hegel's idealist dialectic as well, clearly remains standing in the final analysis in insuperable, quote, contradictions, end quote. It is here, and not in a merely abstract, quote, inversion, end quote, or, quote, turning upside down, end quote, that lies the revolutionary further development of the idealist dialectic of classical bourgeois philosophy into that materialist dialectic which has been theoretically conceptualized by Karl Marx as the method of a new science and practice of the proletarian class, and has been applied in theory and practice alike by Lenin. When we look at the, quote, transition, end quote, from Hegel's bourgeois dialectic to the proletarian dialectic of Marx-Lenin, from this historical viewpoint, we immediately grasp the complete absurdity of the notion that an independent, quote, system, end quote, of materialist dialectic is possible. Only an idealist dialectician could undertake an attempt to free the totality of forms of thought, determinations of thought, categories, which are in part consciously applied in our practice, science, and philosophy, in part move through our minds instinctively and unconsciously from the material which is the subject of our intuiting, imagining, and yearning, and in which they are otherwise shrouded, and then to examine it as a separate material in itself. The last and greatest of the idealist dialecticians, the bourgeois Hegel, had already partly seen through the, quote, untruth, end quote, of this standpoint, and had, quote, introduced content into logical reflection, end quote. But this abstract method is completely absurd for the materialist dialectician. Apart from its respective concrete historical content, a real, quote, materialist, end quote, dialectic can state nothing at all about the determinations of thought and the relations between them. Only from the standpoint of the idealist and thus bourgeois dialectic is it possible to fulfill Thalheimer's demand, according to which dialectics would have to map out the connection of the determinations of thought as a, quote, inner all-around systematic connection of all the categories of thought, end quote. Rather, from the standpoint of the materialist dialectic, this sentence, which Karl Marx once voiced in relation to, quote, economic categories, end quote, is to be applied to the connection of categories or determinations of thought in general. They stand to one another not in a connection, quote, in the idea, end quote, for which, quote, washed-out notion, end quote, Marx thrashed Proudhon, not in an quote, inner systematic connection, end quote, but even their apparently purely logical and systematic sequence is, quote, determined through the relations which they have to one another in modern bourgeois society, end quote. With the alteration of historical reality and practice, the determination of thought and all their connections also alter. To overlook their historical content and to wish to bring the determination of thought and their abstract relations into a system means the surrender of the revolutionary proletarian materialist dialectic in favor of a mode of thought which is only, quote, materialistically, end quote, inverted in theory, but which in practical reality remains the old, unchanged, quote, idealist, end quote, dialectic of bourgeois philosophy. The, quote, materialist dialectic, end quote, of the proletarian class cannot be taught as a practical, quote, science, end quote, with its own particular abstract, quote, material, end quote, nor by its so-called examples. The materialist dialectic of the proletarian class can only be applied concretely in the practice of the proletarian revolution and in a theory which is an imminent real component of this revolutionary practice. Translated by Karl Heinz Otto.